From Diamond Pharmacy and Optics, this is Podcast RX with Chris Bender. When he's not on the mic, Chris is a clinical pharmacist with the Office of Pharmacy Therapeutics and Integrated Clinical Services, or Optics. He routinely helps providers in correctional and long-term care facilities make better medication decisions to improve patient care. And we're so happy that he's sharing his expertise with you.
Hoping that today can be a real knowledge booster.
A classic Batman and Robin or Jordan and Pippin type scenario.
A full armamentarium of options that clinicians can choose from.
With the holiday season upon us and 2024 hurtling to a close, I talked with Chris about some of the clinical, professional, and regulatory changes on his wish list for the new year. Our conversation covers new drug approvals, provider status for pharmacists, and relieving drug shortages, among other areas. Chris also details a few updated drug guidelines and approvals, and we close out the episode with a holiday-inspired look at some precious metals and their uses in medicine. I'm Adam Campbell, and on behalf of Chris and everyone at Diamond Pharmacy, I'd like to wish everyone a happy and healthy holiday season. Thanks for listening.
All right, Chris, happy holidays to you. You have all your shopping done, travel plans ironed out. How's the holiday season treating you so far?
Well, it's busy as ever, and happy holidays to you as well.
Oh, thank you.
Just finished up the Thanksgiving season, and now it just feels like we jumped straight into the next. So, as planned as it possibly can be, but there's always more shopping to be done. You know how it is.
Always more shopping to be done. Yes. And, with all the craziness going on this month between shopping and visiting people and leaving the country or whatever you got going on, it's just a chaotic time. So we thought for this episode, for the end of 2024, the December episode here, Podcast RX with Chris Bender, we thought it'd be a good idea to keep December show fairly light affair and take a look at some pharmacy and healthcare wishes for the new year. And so, Chris, I'm always intrigued by the kinds of trends and developments you see each day consulting with Optics, and I look forward to hearing later in the show what you hope the new year will bring regarding medications, the field of pharmacy, and the like. And after that, I understand you've prepped some pharmacy nerdery that ties into a beloved holiday season TV special.
Oh, I have. There's nothing I like more than to sprinkle a little bit of pharmacy info into the holidays.
You are very adept at it, and I really look forward to hearing what you're going to tell us about. So, speaking of if you enjoy this show, please give us a rating, review where possible. We're still a fairly small show, and Chris's pharmacy nerdery like that, it deserves a wider audience. It really does. I mean that sincerely. So please help us out if you can.
Yeah, and absolutely. Don't forget to tell your friends, because I know personally with my podcast and my podcast listening, word of mouth usually goes a very long way.
Absolutely. Tell your friends, tell the mailman, tell the FedEx guy, and UPS. They're going to be around a lot this time of year. And anybody you can do let them know, help us get the word out there. So, all right. Well, Chris, I have to ask first, do you have any medication news that our friends who spend a lot of time in the clinic should know about?
Absolutely. So, I feel like the end of the year, things kind of slow down a little bit, not just with us, but, everyone, but especially from like a medical news perspective. But that being said, I still feel like there was a few things that did catch my eye in this past month. Now, there weren't many, I know I like to talk a lot about like new drug approvals and stuff, and there weren't really many noteworthy new drug approvals this past month. But one drug did get an expanded approval, and that's Bimzelx. I learned that from one of their television commercials, even though it's Bimzelx. I was always calling it Bimzelx, but apparently it's Bimzelx, which is a biologic medication that I've been particularly excited about. So Bimzelx has only been on the market since late 2023, so not that long of a time, but it's already been approved for 5 indications, which is actually pretty impressive in that short amount of time. Now, those are ankylosing spondylitis, non-radiographic axial spondyloarthritis, plaque psoriasis, psoriatic arthritis, and now, with this new approval, hidradenitis suppurativa. So basically, it works by blocking the IL-17 pathway, which is a key inflammatory pathway that underlies all of these diseases. It's one of the things they have in common. Now, the reason I like this medication is because traditional IL-17 inhibitors have only blocked one type of IL-17, and that is IL-17A, whereas Bimzelx blocks IL-17A, 17F, and 17AF, which ultimately leads to potentially higher efficacy and potency of this medication. Now, the approval for hidradenitis came from the BHERD-1 and BHERD-2 trials, which showed that around 50% of individuals experienced at least a 50% reduction in symptoms. Now, 50% reduction in symptoms may not sound like it's a lot to our listeners, especially, in this era of biologics where we're seeing nearly like 100% symptom resolution in other diseases like psoriasis, for example. But it's important to keep in mind that HS is particularly debilitating. It's marked by painful abscesses, nodules, and even tunnels under the skin, which in many cases can start to leak or drain. So with that in mind, I think a 50% reduction in these symptoms can be a pretty big impact for patients. Now, it's also important to note that currently there are only two other biologics that have been approved for HS, those being Humira and Cosentyx. So as I kind of always say, it's really great to have another option, particularly in a different treatment, in a different medication class, for those who may find these previous options to have been ineffective. Now, in other news, we had a few guideline updates. Now, the two that I'd like to highlight are the GOLD COPD guidelines and the AASM Restless Leg Syndrome guidelines. So the GOLD guidelines remain largely the same from the previous year, at least with regard to the initial management of the disease. Most individuals are recommended to receive, at a minimum, dual long-acting bronchodilators, while those with exacerbation history and evidence of blood eosinophils, which are a marker of inflammation, should receive triple therapy with dual long-acting bronchodilators plus an inhaled corticosteroid. What's new, however, is the inclusion of Ohtuvayre and Dupixent, which listeners may recall us reviewing both of these agents on previous episodes. The Ohtuvayre is now recommended as an add-on option to consider for individuals who continue to experience dyspnea or shortness of breath, despite them already being on an optimized dual long-acting bronchodilator therapy. And Dupixent is now recommended as an add-on option for individuals with blood eosinophils greater than or equal to 300 who continue to experience exacerbations despite being on optimized triple therapy. Now, the other major guideline update, as I previously mentioned, is for restless leg syndrome. Now, the most notable change is that dopamine agonists, so examples of those are pramipexole and ropinirole. These are drugs that have long been a go-to option. They're no longer recommended because, as it actually turns out, these drugs can actually worsen the condition in the long run. So that's actually a pretty big flip in the guidelines. So now it's actually recommended to use gabapentin or pregabalin, more commonly known as Lyrica. So this is going to be a pretty big shift for our correctional partners, since gabapentin and pregabalin are often avoided in the correctional environment, just given their potential for abuse. Additionally, the guidelines now recommend screening patients for iron deficiency and providing iron supplementation if it's needed. It's long been known that iron deficiency can cause and exacerbate RLS, so it's nice to see this inclusion in the guideline.
Chris, on a real quick note, did you see the Wall Street Journal article about Zepbound outperforming Wegovy in the first head-to-head clinical trial between those two drugs? I know that was something, obviously listeners know this is one of our favorite topics on here, the GLP-1 agonists, and this is some big news.
Yeah, absolutely. So just breaking news yesterday before we started recording this was basically Zepbound went head-to-head with Wegovy in a head-to-head trial and basically Zepbound outperformed Wegovy with an average weight loss of 20% compared to about 13%. I mean, that's a considerable difference, and that's not all too surprising because I think you and I were even talking before the show. This is something that I've pretty much mentioned, at least indirectly, in previous podcasts. Like I always said, there's not been studied head to head, but it appears that Zepbound is better or more effective from Wegovy. And here we have it. So it's really good to see. It's just nice to have more. I'm a fan of head-to-head trials because then you can kind of get a hierarchy and understand where things lay in the whole treatment landscape. But unfortunately, you don't often get a lot of head-to-head trials. So whenever you do get one in pharma, it's really, really cool to see.
For sure. And maybe we could develop a podcast on the upcoming GLP wars, perhaps.
Oh, that'd be really good.
Yeah,
there's a lot. There's a lot. There's a lot in the pipeline. In fact, one we'll be talking about a little bit later here. But yeah, it's exciting times for that whole group of drugs.
Absolutely, it is. Let's take a quick break.
Everyone knows that pharmacists dispense medication, but the clinical pharmacists in Diamond Pharmacy's optics team dispense more potent resources, information, and education. The optics pharmacists are frontline medication experts for Diamond's many institutional partners. Whether you work as a provider in corrections or long-term care, the optics team is standing by to answer your on-demand medication questions. But optics is far more than a drug information hotline. They also create proactive knowledge resources like webinars and this podcast to keep partners up to speed with the latest drug developments. And they help providers to better manage costs and therapeutic outcomes with their in-house medication surveillance monitoring program. Learn more about the optics team by going to diamondpharmacy.com and clicking the clinical support tab. See pharmacy care more clearly with optics. Let's get back to Podcast RX.
Thanks again for listening to Podcast RX with Chris Bender. You know, Chris, 2024 passed by in a blink, at least for me it did, and I barely had time to truly reflect on anything that happened this year. But with the impending calendar turn to 2025, I think it's a perfect time to think about what 2025 could bring to the world of pharmacy and medicine, or at the very least, what you hope it could bring. And as a non-pharmacist, I'm always eager to ask you the general questions about your profession and your impressions from your everyday work. So, Chris, what are your top pharmacy and medicine wants and wishes for 2025?
Well, before I dig into what I hope we will see, I want to first discuss some notable things that we will potentially see next year, at least from a drug approval perspective. So, depending on where you look, the numbers may vary slightly by the source, but from what I've been seeing is there's going to be over 60 drugs next year that could gain approval, with half of these considered to be quote unquote practice changing by analysts. So that's exciting. Now, as has been the trend in recent years, the majority of these new drugs are going to be in the oncology space, so for cancer treatment. However, I am far from an expert in this area, so I basically just wanted to make a note of this because up to 14 different tumor types may see important new treatment options, which is fantastic because, it's always encouraging to have more treatment options for cancer. There are some drugs, however, that I will be keeping my eye on. So first, let's talk about endocrine drugs, which we just alluded to earlier. So for obesity, we may be seeing a new medication called CagriSema, which is actually just a combination of cagrilintide, which is a new drug, and semaglutide. So semaglutide is already available for obesity as Wegovy, but CagriSema may be slightly more potent with reports of greater than 20% weight loss. And as we had mentioned with that previous trial, you're looking at like 13 to 14% weight loss with semaglutide. So greater than 20% weight loss, as we saw with Zepbound, is pretty considerable. Now, it's also expected that another obesity drug, that being Zepbound, will be approved to treat comorbid obstructive sleep apnea, since, obstructive sleep apnea is often tied to obesity. It's expected that it's going to be indicated for patients with obesity and obstructive sleep apnea. Treating the obesity basically will kind of help treat the obstructive sleep apnea. So this isn't anything revolutionary. It would kind of make sense to have already worked for this anyway, just by addressing the obesity. But it is nice to see, to have an actual indication for it. And speaking of semaglutide, Ozempic, the formulation that is used for type 2 diabetes, is expected to have its current indication expanded to include the treatment of kidney disease in type 2 diabetes after it improved kidney function in clinical trials. We will also see some activity among non-cancer biologics. So we have Tremfya, which is currently approved for psoriasis, psoriatic arthritis, and ulcerative colitis. It's expected to also gain approval for Crohn's disease. Nemluvio, which is currently approved for prurigo or itchy bumps, is expected to also gain approval for atopic dermatitis. This is a space that's been seeing a lot of activity lately in terms of like specialty drugs and biologics and stuff. So it's nice to see more entering the market for atopic dermatitis, which is a pretty, it can be a pretty, it can take a negative toll on patients' quality of life for sure. And perhaps most notably, there are 6 Stelara biosimilars currently approved that are going to become available starting at the end of January, with the potential to lower cost, obviously. So Stelara is indicated for psoriasis, psoriatic arthritis, ulcerative colitis, and Crohn's disease. So I'm hopeful that with more biosimilar entry into these disease states, it can provide some financial relief for the healthcare, for the healthcare field and patients alike. And finally, and I actually think this is a particularly big one, we may see approval of suzetrigine, which is actually a first-in-class non-opioid pain medication. And what's interesting about this is that it would actually be the first new class of medication to treat acute pain in over 20 years. And just speaking, from my own perspective, anytime we can get a pain medication that has, not to say it's without risks, but potentially with fewer risks than like chronic opioids or NSAIDs even themselves aren't entirely benign. I really think that it could be potentially a great thing for pain management.
Absolutely. And I have to ask Chris, in contrast to NSAIDs and opioids, how does this one work?
Yeah, so basically, it works well from the pure pharmacy nerd perspective. It works by blocking a voltage-gated sodium channel called NaV 1.8. But basically, all that is to say is it basically impedes the body's nerves from being able to transmit the pain signal from, say, your hand as it touches the stove to your brain. So it's basically stopping the pain signal at the source before it can even reach the brain and elicit a response. So just from my purely, because I haven't dug into it entirely like a ton, but when you're talking about voltage-gated sodium channels, you see that more in the space of like anticonvulsant drugs and stuff like that. So I think this is going to work more similar to that, to kind of like slow down the nervous system in a way than your traditional like NSAIDs and acetaminophen and stuff like that.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it really should be. So that is probably going to be, that's what we will probably, or at least perhaps likely see next year. As with, any potential drug approvals, things could go sideways, and maybe none of those things will happen. But, I'd be willing to bet that at least some of those are going to be things that we will see next year. So that's the realist in me. But you know what? If it's the holidays, let's dream a little bit. So here's what I would really want under the tree this year, and by no ways in any particular order. But number one, I'd like to see expanding pharmacists' scope of practice across all states and obtaining provider status at the federal level. Now, the concept of the pharmacist providing direct patient care has been growing a lot over the past decade, and it's continued to grow, and it's becoming more popular, throughout the community and in many treatment locations, particularly like the VA and whatnot, where it's been widely adopted. But it still remains limited by individual state restrictions, which may limit what types of care a pharmacist may provide. So, for an example, some states allow pharmacists to prescribe certain types of medications like birth control or medication for pre-exposure prophylaxis of HIV, or better known as PrEP. However, these instances are certainly the minority of states, and in all of these cases, pharmacists can only provide this type of care so long as it's in collaboration with a physician, requires, signed collaborative agreements and practice documents. So it limits it in that regard. Additionally, pharmacists are not recognized as providers at the federal level, which means they cannot be reimbursed for services under federal programs like Medicare Part D or Medicaid as your traditional provider would, which kind of limits, if you're not able to get paid for something, you can't really provide that service, can't keep the lights on. So by expanding the scope of practice and gaining provider status, I really think that pharmacists could expand access to care for many patients across the country and, at least help kind of relieve some of the pressures that you see in terms of like demand of the healthcare system. Number 2, let's make it easier to substitute biosimilars for originator biologics. Now, currently, for anyone who may not be familiar, you have medications like I mentioned before. So there is Stelara. Stelara is the biologic medication. It was approved. It was on the market for years, but now the patent is ending. And just as you would see with like a generic drug, biologics have a biosimilar drug. It's analogous to brands and generics, but it's not quite the same because the way that they're manufactured, they're not just a generic because you cannot create it in a lab. It has to be, biologically manufactured in a living entity. So while analogous, it's not exactly the same type of situation, which leads to a lot of regulatory hurdles for it. So currently, as the whole system works in the US, not all biosimilars of a given biologic are deemed to be quote unquote interchangeable. Now, this is a designation that allows the pharmacist to automatically substitute that biosimilar at the point of dispensing, similar to how you would get a generic atorvastatin when your prescription is written specifically for Lipitor. Pharmacists are allowed to do that. But in this case, this makes it difficult for the patient to always receive the most cost-effective biosimilar because in some cases, the most cost-effective biosimilar is not deemed interchangeable and cannot be substituted without the provider rewriting for the non-interchangeable biosimilar. And in fact, the prescription needs to be written specifically for the name of the non-interchangeable biosimilar. So to be clear, there are no clinical differences between interchangeable and non-interchangeable biosimilars. It's simply a regulatory hurdle that not every manufacturer obtains as they seek FDA approval. Now, to further complicate things, different states have different rules regarding provider notification and record keeping when substitution actually does occur, making it logistically difficult for an entity like Diamond, who we service facilities across the United States. So what I'm hoping to see is, one, that all biosimilars, once they're approved, are simply designated as interchangeable with their reference biologic. And this isn't a crazy thought because this practice has already been implemented across the European Union for a couple of years now. And number 2, that all states harmonize their biosimilar substitution requirements. That would make things easier for pharmacies that serve, many different states. So, long story short, by making these changes, I think it would encourage more biosimilar use. It could potentially decrease costs and would also decrease provider and pharmacy burden. And number 3, let's try to protect against or at least minimize drug shortages. So this has been huge. Drug shortages in recent years have become more and more prevalent, particularly with generic medications, and it's becoming a bigger and bigger problem across the healthcare system. Now, obviously, there are a lot of different factors that go into the cause of drug shortages, and I know that you actually did an episode on this topic with my colleague Zane, so I'd encourage listeners to go and check that out. But from a pure economics perspective, manufacturers don't see generic medications as a large revenue generator. Now, to be clear, there are a lot of generic manufacturers out there, but not every manufacturer makes every generic drug. So in many cases, there may only be 2 or 3 manufacturers making a particular generic drug. And in some cases, there may only be 1 manufacturer of a given generic drug. So, if anything goes wrong, like they have a delay in receiving the raw ingredient, there's a recall, manufacturing failures, what have you, we can see a shortage happen pretty quickly. So what I'm hoping to see is for the government to provide some sort of incentive structure that would potentially encourage more manufacturers to make more generic medications. This would basically provide some degree of redundancy in the system, and you wouldn't have all of your eggs in one basket.
Kind of reminds me of what happened with baby formula during the pandemic years. You remember that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's the exact same thing. When you put all your eggs in one basket, what happens, when something goes wrong with that basket? So I just think that it's more complicated than what I just said. Basically, everything is, but that'd be my ultimate wish list if I could just, because from our day-to-day perspective in optics here at Diamond, we deal with drug shortage. Like, we're always answering drug shortage questions on a daily basis. What do we use instead of this? Like, how do we handle this type of shortage? So, as Zane spoke, eloquently to in that previous episode, so it'd be nice to see.
Yeah, and one thing, looking at your wish list, it got me thinking about you were talking about the government incentives, and just thinking about the incoming presidential administration. Now, we're not going to get into politics or politicians here, but one thing I wanted to ask you about, just that your last point spurred. There are some people associated with the incoming administration who have a wish to ban direct-to-consumer advertising for pharma and for medications and all that. I was curious, where do you land on that?
Well, as a pharmacist, they follow my, your search history influences what you see. So I see a ton of drug ads, and in a way, it's conflicting, because in a way, they might be good. Like, for example, and I honestly cannot tell you what the drug was, but it was for hyperobstructive cardiomyopathy, or HOCM. And I thought, I have never seen a drug approved for that for that indication before. And to some extent, maybe it's helpful, because a patient sitting there, they might identify something in themselves to at least start a conversation with their doctor. I do think that that's probably less the norm. I do think that they are probably more harmful than good, because it does drive excessive cost, because a lot of times patients will come in and ask for the fancy new drug, simply because that's how we all are as a person. You want the newest iPhone and stuff like that. So they think that it's better for them, and it does pressure. It provides, an extra source of pressure on providers to prescribe medications that may not always be entirely necessary, when they could get by with some of the, some generic medications. Because now, as I was looking at this next year's potential new drugs and stuff, I was even thinking to myself, like, man, we don't really see traditional small molecule drugs much anymore. Like, to reuse my example, like, you don't see atorvastatin and stuff like that coming out anymore. And there's a potential reason for that. We're becoming better at targeting and whatnot, being more specific with our approach to treatment. But that also means that they're much more expensive medications. So I think there's oftentimes you can get by with using cost-effective generics and doing the first steps better, rather than jumping to like a fancy newer type of thing. So I guess I'm sort of in the middle on it, but I think it probably is more harm than good. That makes sense.
Sure. And isn't it just the United States and I believe New Zealand that allow the direct to consumer advertising? That's correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah. And ultimately, I do think, if you were to, I've always been of the mindset of, rather than promoting the drugs, because promoting them directly to providers is kind of dubious as well. But rather than promoting the drugs, it should be more promoting the disease state. But there's no money in that. But really, the real answer is like providing education to the providers of what is the best way to treat a disease state, and not necessarily, okay, now I know about this drug, how can I fit it into my daily life? It's better to know about the entire algorithm rather than just know one drug and kind of, squeeze it in whenever you can.
Either way, Chris, you got some big wishes for the new year. We're going to continue to keep an eye on those and see if any of them do come to fruition, because I'm sure we'll circle back and talk about them right here on Podcast RX. Let's take a quick break.
In the realm of corrections health, not all electronic health records are created equally. Sapphire EHR is a comprehensive, cloud-based electronic health record designed specifically for correctional health providers. Since 2011, Sapphire has worked one-on-one with healthcare staff in jails and prisons to develop and refine a suite of features and modules to manage total inmate patient care. From MedPass to dental care to documentation of lab results and creating custom forms, Sapphire's correction-specific features can be scaled to meet the needs of the largest correctional facilities down to the smallest local jails. And it's all backed up by 100% in-house hosting, training, and support, with a 24/7 help desk. Get a closer look at the Corrections EHR deployed in over 400 facilities across 36 states and territories. Visit www.sapphire-health.com and schedule a demo today. Sapphire EHR, cloud-based, compatible, correction-specific electronic health records. Now back to Podcast RX with Chris Bender.
All right, so Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, untouchable holiday classic, right? And Chris, you and I, we're both parents of young kids, and I assume our children are both discovering Rudolph for the first time this Christmas. Mine definitely are. Is that true of your son?
Yeah, well, yours is, you got a couple that are a little older than mine, but yeah, I feel like my son is now he's just now hitting the age, so he's 2, and he's just now hitting that age where he can actually kind of understand and appreciate Christmas this year. So we've already been enjoying some Christmas songs. He knows, he definitely knows Santa. But I think this discussion made me realize, we got to start hitting some of the holiday classics, like those old claymation videos. So
sure. And Rudolph is going back to is going to be broadcast on NBC for the first time in 50 odd years. So there is that.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
I mean, of course, now everything's all about the streaming, but if you
Yeah.
were so inclined to watch it on TV like we did when we were growing up, that's where it's at now. But anyway, why are we talking about Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer on this pharmacy podcast? Well, when we were discussing the planning this December episode, Chris, you told me in the most Chris Bender way possible that you had a loose tie-in between one of the more popular songs from the Rudolph special, and no, it's not the title track, and the use of heavy metals in medicine. And I was intrigued. And of course, what 2 heavy metals feature prominently in the Rudolph soundtrack? Silver and gold. And I just have to say that, after putting that all together, you could say that Burl Ives was a heavy metal singer quite a few years before the genre was even a thing. So, but anyway, Chris, how do heavy metals like silver and gold enrich medicine?
Well, if you give me long enough, I'm sure I could find a way to turn Rudolph's red nose into a trivia capsule and workshop it for next year.
Let's do it.
So silver and gold. Well, silver has been used since ancient times, obviously as a form of currency and even jewelry, but silver offered something even more utilitarian to the ancient peoples. It's been noted that the Phoenicians, so the Mediterranean civilization that existed from 1550 to 300 BCE, well, they would keep their water, wine, and vinegar in silver pots to prevent them from spoilage. Now, ultimately, this was explained by Hippocrates, circa 375 BC, who observed that silver had antimicrobial properties, or antibacterial properties, which not only made it useful for storage, but also effective to treat and prevent disease. Silver was used throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries as a solution to treat eye infection, as a suture to prevent surgical infection, and even taken orally to treat a variety of diseases such as epilepsy, gonorrhea, and the common cold. Though I should note here that oral use was limited due to its potential for toxicity. Now, although silver's use has diminished due to the advent of antibiotics, silver still plays a role in modern medicine for infection prevention in wound care. So we have things like silver nitrate, which is used to cauterize infected wound tissue, silver sulfadiazine, which is applied to burn wounds to promote healing and prevent infection. And also many wound dressings are also infused with other silver compounds for this same purpose. So we're using silver a lot to promote wound healing and prevent infection. Now, the use of gold in medicine predates that of silver. So gold-based remedies were documented in ancient Egyptian medical texts, highlighting their use for treating skin diseases and alleviating joint pain, given gold's antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties. Now, ancient Chinese medicine also included gold. They believed it had rejuvenating properties, and they used it to treat tuberculosis, smallpox, and even impotence. And gold continued to be used throughout the ages, with records from medieval eras suggesting its use for diseases of the eye, leprosy, quote unquote, all blemishes of the body, and even preserving youth. In modern medicine, however, gold's utility is much more limited, mainly to rheumatoid arthritis, which it's sold as a drug named Oranofen, which is still available today, although I've personally never seen Oranofen used to treat RA, perhaps because the advent of more potent and safer medications. But the future may be bright for gold, as gold nanoparticles are currently being investigated as a drug delivery system for cancer therapy. So, Earl Ives in his song asked, "For silver and gold, how do you measure its worth? Just by the pleasure it gives here on earth?" Well, I'd suggest we measure their worth not just by the pleasure they bring, but also the utility they've brought us throughout the ages.
Well, Chris, I want to thank you again, as always, for sharing your knowledge with us. I really enjoyed that. And again, it's a real gift to the listeners, and I'm looking forward to a prosperous new year of shows ahead. So I just wanted to say Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Holidays to everyone, to Chris, to you, your family, and of course to all of our listeners.
Yeah, I'd like to extend the same thing as well. Happy holidays to everyone, to you, Adam, and I've really enjoyed the run we've had thus far. I know we are still in sort of the infantile stages, so I'm looking forward to next year whenever we have the entire year ahead of us. So hopefully we can continue to kind of keep on keeping on, you know.
Absolutely, and just doing new things with the format and getting some other voices on here to definitely a goal of the new year to get some more of your optics colleagues on here. They obviously we had them on the previous iteration of the show, so we want to get them back on here with us and expanding it even further beyond them. So yeah, looking forward to that. And one gift that we definitely appreciate this holiday season is some fresh ratings and reviews of the show where you listen to your podcast. If you can, please take the time to let us know what you think of the show and help us get in the ears of more listeners. So Chris, as you said, it's been a blast so far on this short run. Looking forward to 2025 and talking to you next month.
Yeah, and just remember, 5-star always fits, never needs returned. So keep that in mind.
That's right. Okay. All right, Chris. Well, I will see you in 2025. Have a great holiday.
Hey, likewise. Take care.
Podcast RX features conversations with healthcare professionals. The statements and opinions discussed herein are for informational purposes only. This podcast should not be considered professional medical advice and should not be used as the substitute for the advice of an appropriately qualified and licensed healthcare professional. Therefore, listeners must not rely on the statements made herein.
Podcast RX is a production of Diamond Pharmacy Services. Find our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you enjoy podcasts. And where possible, please rate and review. If you'd like to get in touch with the show directly, shoot us an email at podcastrx@diamondpharmacy.com. Thank you again for your support.